Hiya. Okay, I just said hello. Calm down. Hello, he's back. Today, I need to take this sweatshirt off. I'm literally living in this thing now. It's really manky. So today we are going to have a look at experiments, particularly lab experiments, but I will talk about field experiments. And you do need to be aware of the difference. So a lab experiment is something that happens in a laboratory. It's carefully, that music's quite loud. Alexa, volume 3. Alexa, volume 2. So, lab experiments take place in the lab. They're carefully set up by the researcher to test variables, controllable variables. We'll talk more about those in a minute. A field experiment takes place in the field, not a field, but a field, the field. Its natural setting. It's got high amounts of ecological validity. People are in the natural setting, and you could argue they're way more likely to behave naturally there. There's something all over this phone. Let's have a look. Oh, it's still there. Never mind. Okay. So firstly, let's look at lab experiments. Now, on pages 19 and 20 in the booklet you've got at home, you can just read those pages through, to be honest, and it would be useful to take notes on lab experiments on page 172 and field experiments on page 173 of your home textbook. Other than that, I will start to talk about them individually now. So on page 21 of your booklets is a page that looks like this. So it is talking about Milgram's lab experiment. And you'll see there's a place to put praise of the experiment and problems with the experiment. And I've given you some handy concepts to use at the bottom. Remember, to get the really good marks in the exam, you need to be using these concepts. I don't know what's happening to this. Oh, that's a better angle, isn't it? You need to be using these concepts with confidence and really accurately. So what I'd like you to do is go off and type into YouTube. I know some of you have already seen this in psychology. Type in Milgram's experiment and it will come up, guaranteed, loads of different versions of it. Can you watch that, please? And then, so pause this now if you need to, and then we'll talk through it and the pros and cons. It's probably the most useful lab experiment to do this piece of work about. Remember, in the exam, what you're ultimately going to have to do is talk about the pros and cons of a certain method with all the keywords. So we're going to hammer through them again and again and again when we do this. So I'm going to assume now you've watched it. So let's have a look at the advantages of laboratory experiments. I'm hoping you're going to have had a go, at least in rough, at filling this in. But if not, I'll talk you through it. So one advantage of a lab experiment using the words at the bottom is that the researcher can control the internal variables. Now, you think about Milgram's experiment. Think about the internal variables they were controlling. So the people who were allegedly being electrocuted, of course, were acting, and they were controlling their response to that to see how much the person they're experimenting on, the tester, would follow the examples of Milgram wearing the white coat. And as you can see, they followed it to an alarming extent. So they control the internal variables. And also, of course, they could take in people, they could control some external variables by taking in people that reflected society at that time, so genders, social class, ethnicity. So they tried to get a fairly representative sample. But of course, how representative can a sample be in a time-consuming experiment? So although he tried to reflect American society at that time, it was still a very small sample, and you could argue that it's very hard then to generalise the findings to the target population, which was Americans, although actually he did repeat the experiment again and again, and they found very similar, as they grew the sample, they found very similar results every time, i.e. most people were happy to send huge amounts of electric volts through someone if they were told to by a man in a white coat. Okay, I'm looking for other words here. Researcher effect is the weird one here, and we're talking about advantages of a lab experiment. the researcher effect was the experiment in a sense. Milgram standing there in a white coat and telling them they'd ruin the experiment if they stopped, and therefore they must continue to electrocute people or it would all be destroyed. So in a sense, this is an odd one. This was based around researcher effect. Reliability is an important one. So we talked about, we talked about how reliability should be, to think about it, is it standardized research, i.e. exactly the same every time, and therefore can you repeat it accurately? Now, actually, we normally use questionnaires to talk about that, or structured interviews, but actually lab experiments can be, this really isn't working, isn't it? Lab experiments can be really standardized and accurately repeated as well, and therefore you can kind of test. I look like a weird white head floating around here, very odd. We can, I've totally lost my thread. I'm finding it very alarming. Looking at my head sort of disappear there. What was I saying? Reliability. Yes, it can be accurately tested. Really to keep testing for patterns and trends in the research. Okay. Other words. Let's have a look at some disadvantages with this piece of research, which are many. I mean, ethics is the obvious one to mention. So you'll know from when we did ethics that one of the things the researcher really has to look out for is the well-being of his participants, of his sample. And you could very much argue that they were probably, that their well-being was damaged by this. Nobody wants to discover about themselves that they could have acted like a Nazi in the Second World War. And ultimately, that's what he was trying to test, remember. Okay. I guess other ethical guidelines think about, he deceived them. So although they'd given informed consent to take part in an experiment, there was deceit involved because they had no idea the nature of the experiment, which kind of leads on to a discussion of validity. Because if he had told them why they were there, hadn't he? If he told them why they were there, there would have been no validity, no truth to this. So in a sense, by deceiving them, he maintains quite high levels of truth. Depth, not so much. We never really discover the reasons why in depth that they followed orders so what's the word I mean? So strictly. Other words. Verstehen. Is it high in Verstehen or not? I mean, in theory, no, because again, he didn't use unstructured interviews. We never really understand the meanings behind their behaviour as you'd want to if something's high in understanding, empathy, Verstehen. But actually, we do get quite a good insight into just how distressed they were during the process of the experiment. Okay, so thank you, Ferdy. There's some of the pros and cons. I'm wondering if I've missed anything out. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that for now. Another one you could watch, if you type it in, is the Stanford experiment, prison experiment, which is another lab experiment. Whoa, the ethics in that are off the poor ethics in that are off the scale. So that's well worth looking up as well. As is Bandura, Ross and Ross, the Bobo doll experiment. Obviously, we'll talk about all of these when we meet again, but it would be useful to watch them in the meantime. Okay. Page 22, miss out for now. It's kind of an essay outline, which we'll do together at a later date. And then I'll come back with the exciting world that is questionnaires and social surveys next. All right, bye.